Well, I'm probably going to do some more Zizek later on, but I'm going to take a breather and talk about something that's kind of near and dear to my heart, education. And I'm going to do that through discussing two different works on education, one by John Locke and the other by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So today I'm going to get into John Locke's book, Some Thoughts Concerning Education. If you haven't studied Enlightenment thoughts on education, I'm sure some of these ideas will seem a little weird. Others will seem very familiar. So let's see. And you can think about how much of your education reflected this and how much of your education did not reflect John Locke's views on education. Locke's advice in Some Thoughts Concerning Education aimed at instilling the qualities associated with pursuing peacetime success in business and society. For instance, the young gentleman could not be brought up in softness and opulence, but he had to get used to hardship at an early age, according to Locke. Locke observed that mothers often wanted to coddle their children, bundle them up, and save them from all risks, but he advised them to let them go out in the cold, not wrap them up at all night long, and to bathe them in cold water. Happy Mother's Day, by the way. A boy should be exposed to the sun and wind instead of sheltered in the shade, and girls were allowed a little leeway in this regard for the sake of their beauty, but they should also still get outside. So you may think this the perfect training to develop a Spartan warrior, but not the thing for a more sedate life. However, Locke thought that part of what it took to be a modern gentleman was hardiness, and that many children were treated too softly, which made them unable to handle adversity. He wrote, quote, "And if my young master be to be kept always in the shade, and never exposed to the sun and wind, for fear of his complexion, it may be a good way to make him a beau, but not a man of business." Well, that gives you a clue as to what the ultimate goal Locke had in mind. It was to be a man of business. He said the implication was that boys should not be too concerned about how they looked, and that such concern was effeminate and therefore to be avoided. I guess no metrosexuals allowed, although I must say, have you checked out some of the hairdos from Locke's time? In Locke's view, children's lives should be simple. No fancy clothing should be allowed, especially not binding clothing that could deform the natural development of their bodies. They should have a simple diet free of lots of spices and fatty meats. Locke complained that, quote, "Many are made gourmands and gluttons by custom that were not so by nature." Ideally, they should eat just once a day like the men of ancient Rome, and the meals should not be regular, but their time should be varied so that children learn to go without food if necessary and to not become dependent upon a routine. He said a gentleman in any age ought to be so bred as to be fitted to bear arms and be a soldier. But this was because the desired qualities in breeding up the soldier and the businessman overlapped to a certain extent. So, Locke used pride of gender to motivate boys to avoid certain things, like eating too much sweetmeats or lazing in bed for too long. But a boy's bed should be hard, so that he gets used to sleeping wherever he might have to stay for the night. After dealing with the physical side of rearing boys to be men, Locke turned to their discipline. He wrote that the aim of education was virtue, and that the great principle and foundation of all virtue and worth is placed in this, that a man is able to deny himself his own desires, cross his own inclinations, and purely follow what reason directs as best, though the appetite lean the other way. Self-control, then, was the essence of virtue. Locke advised against spoiling children in all ways. Parents who indulged their children's vices, looking the other way when they did wrong, and thought such habits as talking back or lying were harmless when children were small would learn later that they had created lazy, effeminate, and tyrannical adults. Children's bad characters would become a problem for their parents later, who would taste the bitter waters when they themselves have poisoned the fountain. If a child was not denied the toys and play he desired too much when he was young, the results could be disastrous. He would want wine and women when he was older and make a fool of himself. So, he should not be indulged or taught to be proud of his clothing or things. Children should understand that the things they received were given to them because their parents found them suitable, and on no occasion should they receive anything if they cried for it. This is a classical liberal upbringing, to be sure. They love dominion and power, and this appears to Locke to be the origin of the most vicious habits in adults. Indicating what he thought of human nature more generally, Locke called the love of power and wealth the two roots of almost all the injustice and contention that so disturb human life. So they must be eliminated in childhood if we wish to overcome them in adulthood. He saw raw human nature as selfish, materialistic, power-hungry, unruly, disorderly, and easily made more so. So human beings needed a lot of appropriate molding and shaping to become fit for society. So think about this. Locke was sort of like the father of classical liberalism. And he had no trouble with the economic theory that a rising tide lifts all boats. He wanted this gentleman that he is attempting to describe how to educate here to become a business success, but he is making a distinction between what I would call self-interest and avarice. That's actually a pretty classical liberal move to make that you see resonating all the way up and through and beyond the American founding fathers. Whether you can do it or not, whether you can make that distinction in practice or not is an open question, but Locke thought you could if you educated people and brought them up correctly. Because it was also important that they become good citizens in order to keep that system alive, which he thought would guarantee their freedom. Scholar Nathan Tarkov has pointed out that all of Locke's admonitions surrounding the development of self-control should not be mistaken for a preference for asceticism. Locke's aim was to produce adults who could control their appetites so that they could follow what reason considers best. It was not that Locke was anti-materialistic, but rather that he supported the type of self-interest suitable to the new commercial society, capable of delaying gratification in order to build something better. Without the ability to use reason to deny oneself an immediate desire, there would be no ability to produce long-term financial stability and growth. He recommended a slow handing over of authority to the child. First, the child must learn that his passions and desires can be curbed by someone, and then he can learn how to curb them for himself. The essence of the enlightened self-interest of delayed gratification. Though exact timing is different for each child, young adulthood was the time to loosen one's grip. The reverence that older children had for their parents should be the result not of fear of losing an inheritance, but of the respect the parents have gained from having wisely raised their children. So you'd expect that Locke would advise the use of the rod when children are young, as in, spare the rod and spoil the child. But Locke advised that corporal punishment should be used very sparingly and only after other methods didn't work. He said that children who are punished too much did not become the best adults, and he wanted ultimately to have citizens capable of independent thought and action so that they could safeguard their liberty. If it was used at all, it should be done early on to establish authority, but should quickly be replaced by instilling in the child a sense of shame. Instilling a sense of shame in children was a means of planting self-control in them. Parents and others should show them esteem and acceptance if they behaved as they should, and should treat them coldly and with disapproval when they behaved badly. With this line of reasoning, Locke introduced a type of honor. The opposite of shame was honor, or well-placed pride. If done early on, this method would make children want to win others' approval for their good behavior and make them feel badly when they misbehaved, precisely because they had lost that approval. Good reputation and shame were old traditional themes of proper character formation, which Locke still chose to employ, at least in early character formation. Locke seemed to think that the most likely thing to which children and young men would become enslaved was their own outsized passions, whether it was selfish, overblown sense of manliness, or addictions to drink and sex, all of which would keep them from later becoming successful in business and decent society. So, recommending an education designed to teach youth self-control, and this would, in his view, provide greater prospects for raising men who could think beyond the moment and not be tugged this way and that by their own desires and the trends and fashions of the moment. Pride must at first be an extrinsic motivator. It was a childish thing, according to Locke. It was not children's sense of honor or virtue or even desired manliness that would turn them in the right direction, but their pride. Pride, then, must at first be an extrinsic motivator. It was a childish thing, It was not children's sense of honor or virtue or even desired manliness that would turn them in the right direction, but their pride. It was something that hopefully would be surpassed in adulthood by true virtue. This virtue would understand right and wrong as realities which motivate behavior rather than concern for how one viewed or was treated by others. While pride may keep children and men in line, and would therefore be socially useful, mature virtue was, in his view, even more socially and politically useful. He explicitly made the connection between good training in youth and good thinking in maturity. He said, "He that by frequent practice has not been used to this employment of his understanding, it is no more wonder that he should not, when he is grown into years, be able to bring his mind to it, than that he should not be on the sudden able to grave or design, dance on the ropes, or write a good hand, who has never practiced either of them." In other words, basically, if you practice these things when you're young, they will be habits deeply ingrained when you're older. By then, he was hoping that it would be intrinsic instead of extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation would not be about rank, but about how a man felt about himself in his relationship with God, for instance. Locke knew that many adults would continue to be motivated by pride and shame, but he was aiming at the very best education and the very best character as a product of that education, and in his view, the very best outcome was the self-regulating, internally motivated gentleman. So there's his thoughts on early childhood education, and next week we'll move on to his thoughts on the education of the young adult.